Hello, everyone, and welcome to iCatholic. I'm Bill Kemmy. This program is part of a series we're doing in honour of Pope Benedict. We're just inviting a number of people to come on and join with us to share their own reflections on the passing of Pope Benedict XVI. Of course, his great contribution to the Church, his life of service to the Church. This evening we're joined by Michael Kelly, the editor of the Irish Catholic. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. Let's begin maybe with might be a strange question, but how important of a figure was Pope Benedict XVI?
I mean, really, it's no exaggeration to say that Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, was really a towering figure in the second half of the 20th century in the Catholic Church, going right back to the 1950s when he was a young theologian, and then his influence on the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, right through his various writings, the many volumes, to coming to Rome, to working in the Vatican under John Paul II, and then, of course, after the death of John Paul II, being elected Pope himself in 2005. So it's no exaggeration to say that the man has had a front row seat in the Catholic Church and the major events happening in the global church for over 70 years. And I mean, that's quite something. I think the depth of his theological writing, the breadth of his theological writing. I mean, this was a man who touched on dogmatics, moral theology, who actually was probably one of the first people in the Vatican to touch on the whole idea of ecology. I mean, it's very common for us now to understand that ecology, looking after the environment around us, God's creation, that's something that should be central to Catholic teaching, but that wasn't always obvious. And Joseph Ratzinger was ahead of the curve on that. I would say if you want to look at a legacy, I think ultimately the legacy of the man will probably be more influential, much more influential than just his 8 years in the papacy. Because if you go to theology faculties now around the world, if you go to seminaries where future priests are being trained, many of the texts that are being read there by younger people who are being formed are the texts of Joseph Ratzinger, and that will continue for many years to come. So perhaps ultimately more important than, as I say, just the time as Pope will be that huge contribution to the Church's self-understanding of itself, to the Church's theology, which will continue to be unpacked. I mean, there's many of the volumes that still have not been published in other languages other than German, and I suspect his death now will give new impetus to that. There are a lot of Ratzinger scholars, a lot of devotees, and I think they will probably now put themselves to that task with gusto.
Let's go into a little bit more detail, I suppose, about how Pope Benedict came into the papacy. Of course, we have to talk about Pope John Paul, St. John Paul II. So how did Cardinal Ratzinger come into the papacy? And in some ways, how did Pope Benedict come to step down from the papacy?
I think to understand the papacy of Benedict XVI, you have to go back to those moments when John Paul II was dying in 2005, a very, very emotional time when this really heroic man who had led the church for more than 25 years was dying almost in a very public fashion. And Cardinal Ratzinger then at the time had been the Dean of the College of Cardinals, so he supervised a lot of the events around that. And obviously many of the other cardinals saw in him someone who they thought would be a worthy successor to John Paul II. Now, it should be borne in mind that a couple of years beforehand, Cardinal Ratzinger had actually asked to retire. He wanted to leave his job at the Vatican. He wanted to go back to Germany to play his piano, to read his books, to feed his cats, to live a life worthy of a retired man who had contributed that much to the church. So sometimes people maybe have this idea that, he was waiting around in order to become the next pope. Nothing in his life indicates that in any way. This was a man who really didn't want this and had this thrust upon him. Very, very much so. And like he has done at every other time in his life, whether it's becoming archbishop, cardinal, prefect, these various things, he's taken on those roles because, as he himself has explained, he's always tried to see the gentle hand of providence in those things. Now, probably reformer is not a word that would immediately come to mind when one speaks of Benedict XVI. And yet the paradox of that is he probably has reformed the papacy more than anyone in certainly the last 150 years by announcing on that day, that day in February 2013 extremely unexpected when we were all doing something else and he was at a routine meeting at the Vatican. Well, at least we thought it was routine, and he announced that he would step down at the end of that month, that he no longer felt he had the physical or the mental strength to continue as Pope. If someone had have said 3 days beforehand that that would happen, that there would be that type of papal transition, and we would have this new office of the Pope Emeritus, no one would have believed them. And yet, because Pope Benedict did it in such a gentle way and such a reassuring way, and everyone was absolutely clear that this was his desire, that this was his will, it became a very normal thing, and it became something that Catholics around the world supported immediately.
It's interesting that when we speak about Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, that we should remember their early years, and of course, which was marked in such a terrible way by the Second World War. What influence do you think that had on both men?
So if you look at where both men were coming from, I mean, both men grew up on opposite sides of the same border, grew up under a time of very, very dark and desolate times under the totalitarian Nazi regime. Poland was occupied by the Nazis while John Paul II was growing up there. Likewise, Benedict, his family were committed anti-Nazis, and they both saw close at hand just the dangers of totalitarianism. And ultimately, both men, I think, saw that what was at the root of totalitarianism was always trying to replace God with the state. And they saw the great danger on that when the rights of human beings are, I suppose, trampled upon because of some kind of perceived greater need, like the need of the state, the need of the country. They saw that that wreaked havoc upon humanity. And that's why Benedict spoke in 2005, and he had this phrase about totalitarianism. He described it as absolutizing what is not absolute, i.e. the state, and trying, if you like, to relativize what is absolute, i.e. God. So that's why they sought to talk a lot about this idea of human dignity, which was God-given, which was by virtue of the humanity of people. And this is why they deserved respect. And this is why they deserved to have their universal human rights respected. So I think that's key in understanding what you might even describe as a type of Christian humanism that both men shared.
There's no way of speaking about church leadership of the last generation or so without speaking about the abuse scandal in the church, that awful truth of abuse and the abject failure of the church over a number of generations to tackle it and to go in the right direction. When we reflect on the life of Pope Benedict, I suppose there's positives in this regard, that there was things that he got right and helped the church go in the right direction, but there's things that he admitted himself that he fell short, that he like many of his generation, they didn't do the right thing at the right time. How do we sum all of this up, Michael?
It's a mixed record, but I would say that probably more than anyone else at the Vatican for his generation, he got this issue, and he saw just how corrosive it was for the moral authority of the church, because ultimately all the church has is moral authority, and this issue has so blighted the lives of those who were abused, but has also dented the moral authority of the church at a time when the church's voice is needed in society perhaps more than ever. So I think to his dying day, he probably regretted the earlier feelings, or perhaps the fact that there was a learning curve around this in the church. He wrote last February that he was conscious of his own feelings, and he knew that he would soon stand before God, who was going to be his judge, and he hoped that he prayed that as well as being his judge, that God would be a father to him and a brother to him and would accept his shortcomings. But the issue of clerical sexual abuse and the mishandling of that by many people in leadership positions of the church, that casts a long shadow, and it's impossible to speak about the pontificate of Benedict XVI without speaking about that, because really, even though we knew about this during the pontificate of John Paul II, this really exploded under the papacy of Benedict XVI. And in some ways, there's just an inherent unfairness. If you're the person at the helm of the time, at the time when the tsunami of abuse goes off, then a lot of the anger gets directed towards you. And I think we saw that with Benedict XVI. Look, I think it's very important that Pope Benedict was the first Pope to meet with victims as well, to hear their experiences, and what he encountered in that was what anyone who has spoken with people who have been abused by priests and religious know, that very often these are people of deep and profound faith who acutely feel that the damage that was done to them, part of that damage is the fact that many of them lost their faith, they lost their trust in the church as a result of this abuse, that these are not people who were external to the church, or not people who are fixated on trying to drag the church's name through the mud or trying to tear the church down or anything like this. These were devout Catholics who were at the very heart of the church, which precisely meant that they were able to be targeted for abuse. So I think that was a very profound experience for Pope Benedict, and I think it was something that had a huge impact on him personally. I mean, I heard someone talk recently about when he met with survivors in Britain, and he wept with them.
We might come back and finish with the writings of Pope Benedict, Cardinal Ratzinger, which you've rightly spoken about, Michael. Just maybe to go into detail on it, what would be your own particular favourite, or what would you recommend to people if they wanted to read Benedict? What volume should they reach for?
I think if you want to read something from Pope Benedict that you'll find very spiritually enriching, spiritually uplifting, and actually get an understanding of the man's spirituality himself, and actually in some ways the simplicity of his spirituality, I would look at the trilogy of books, Jesus of Nazareth. He wrote those books while he was Pope, but he insisted that he was writing them as a private individual. Now, that's not an easy thing to do, because the Pope is always the Pope. But in the introduction, he actually says, look, read these reflections, and if you disagree with me, that's fine, because I'm writing these as Joseph Ratzinger. And I think he brings the gospel to life in those books. So I've personally found those very enriching.
Thanks for that, Michael. And we might finish it. You might tell us, I'm sure you've got extensive coverage of the passing of Pope Benedict in the paper this week.
We have indeed. We've done a special edition of the paper this week covering a lot of the life and contribution of Benedict XVI, both before his papacy, during his papacy, and actually post-papacy as well. And we've asked some people who knew him very well, who worked closely with him, to write their accounts of the sort of man that he was as well. And Shea Brady, the deputy editor of the Irish Catholic, is in Rome, and he's going to be covering the lying in state of Pope Benedict, and also the funeral, which we expect to be a simpler affair. By his own will, we know that heads of state have not been invited to it, as would be normal with the Pope. It will be presided over by Pope Francis, which in and of itself is a very historic thing. And we'll have full coverage of that from Rome in the Irish Catholic in the coming edition.